The day Rowena Stahl drove her wagon onto the bogland, half the town of Millhaven came out just to watch her make a fool of herself. They lined the road the way people do when they expect a spectacle, not shouting, not cruel about it, just standing with their arms folded and their mouths set in that particular way that meant they'd already decided how the story ended. Rowena was 24 years old, recently widowed, and she had just signed papers on 40 acres of wetland that nobody in Harlan County had ever successfully farmed. The previous owner had tried to drain it twice and given up both times. Before him, a cattle outfit had written the land off entirely after losing 3 steers to the soft ground near the eastern channel. The deed had passed through 5 hands in 20 years, each time for less money than the time before. Rowena paid what little she had left after the funeral for it. Her husband, Dale Stahl, had died in February, a lung fever that came fast and didn't leave room for goodbyes. They'd been married 3 years and had nothing to show for it but the wagon, 2 horses, a crate of tools, and a small savings that Dale had kept in a coffee tin under the floorboards. Rowena found it the morning after the burial. $41 and some change. She sat at the kitchen table of the rented house they wouldn't be able to keep and counted it twice. She didn't cry anymore by then. She'd cried in December when the fever started, and again in January when the doctor came and said what he said, and again the night Dale died with her hand on his chest. By February she was done with crying. What she had left was a kind of cold, practical clarity that frightened her a little, because it didn't feel like grief and it didn't feel like strength either. It just felt like arithmetic. She had $41, a wagon, 2 horses, and no family within 400 miles. She needed land, she needed it cheap, and she needed it to have something on it that other people had missed. The bogland at the south end of Millhaven cost her $38. The man who sold it to her, a banker named Tobias Wren, who kept his office above the feed store, looked at the paper she pushed across his desk and then looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what you're buying," he said. "It wasn't exactly a question." "I've walked it," Rowena said. "It floods every spring. There's standing water on the eastern half near on 6 months a year. The soil in the low sections is black muck 2 feet deep before you hit anything solid. You can't graze it. You can't plow it. 2 men before you tried to dig drainage ditches, and—" "I know about the ditches," Rowena said. "I've seen them." Wren set his pen down. "Mrs. Stahl, I've been in this county 20 years. I've seen good land go bad and bad land stay bad. What you're describing, what you seem to be planning—" "I'm not planning anything I'd like to discuss right now," Rowena said. "I'd just like to sign the paper." He let her sign it, and on the day she drove the wagon out to take possession of the land, the people of Millhaven came to watch, the way they always did when they expected something to go wrong. Her husband's younger brother, Calvin Stahl, came with her. He was 19 and had his brother's jaw, and none of his brother's patience. And he didn't entirely understand what Rowena was doing, but he had nowhere else to be, and she had asked him to help. A woman named Inez Durr, who had been Rowena's one real friend in Millhaven. They'd met at the dry goods store the previous summer and found they liked each other immediately, in that rare way that doesn't require explanation, rode alongside the wagon on her own horse. Inez was 31 and had worked as a school teacher for 6 years and had strong opinions about most things, which she generally kept to herself unless asked. She had not asked what Rowena was doing with the bogland. She'd offered to help instead, which Rowena thought said something important about her character. The land looked, that first afternoon, exactly like what it was. The road from the main track turned into a 2-rut path, and the path turned soft within a quarter mile. The horses didn't like it. Calvin didn't like it. There was a smell, not a bad smell exactly, but a deep, organic smell, like something perpetually in the process of becoming something else. The grass was coarse and grew in uneven tufts. Near the eastern channel, the ground shivered slightly when you walked on it, the way saturated earth does when it's holding more water than it ought to. There was a small structure on the property, more shack than house, that the previous owner had built and then abandoned. The roof was partially collapsed on the south side. The floor inside was packed dirt. There was one window and it had no glass. "Well," Calvin said, standing in the doorway. "We'll fix the roof first," Rowena said. He looked at her. "With what lumber? There's a mill 6 miles east." "I've already spoken to them." He looked at the room, then back at her. "Rowena, I know what it looks like," she said. "I need you to trust me for a little while." Calvin was quieter for a moment. Then he pulled off his coat and asked where she wanted him to start. The people of Millhaven were not unkind, exactly. They were the kind of practical, hard-working people who called things what they were and didn't see much point in softening the truth. When Rowena came into town for supplies in those first weeks, the conversations she had were the kind that meant well and landed badly. At the dry goods store, a man named Orville Tench, who owned the hardware adjacent and had opinions about land value that he considered well-founded, told her directly that she'd been taken advantage of. "Wren should have talked you out of it," he said. "That land's been a money pit since before your time." A woman named Claudette Mercer, who ran the boarding house and had lived in Millhaven all her life, put a hand on Rowena's arm and said she hoped she had some savings left over for when things didn't work out. The minister's wife said she would pray for her. Rowena thanked them all and bought what she came for and drove home. What she didn't tell any of them, what she hadn't told anyone except Inez, and even then only partially, was what her grandfather had told her when she was 11 years old, walking a piece of wetland in eastern Pennsylvania where his family had farmed for 2 generations. Her grandfather, Edmund Marsh, her mother's father, quiet man who communicated mostly through demonstration rather than explanation, had taken her to the edge of a cranberry bog one October morning and crouched down at the waterline. He'd shown her how the bog retained water through the driest summer months, how the peat underneath acted as a sponge, absorbing rain and releasing it slowly, how the standing water that everyone considered a nuisance was in fact a resource, if you understood what you were looking at. His family had harvested cranberries from that bog for 40 years. They'd flooded the fields deliberately each fall to float the berries to the surface. When the neighboring farms were struggling in drought years, and there were drought years in that part of Pennsylvania, years when the wells went shallow and the creek beds showed gravel, his land always had water. Always. "Most people look at wet ground and see what they can't do with it," he'd told her. "That's a failure of imagination, not a fact about the land." Rowena had been 11. She hadn't fully understood it then, but she'd kept the knowledge the way you keep certain things. Folded up, somewhere in the back of your mind, waiting for the day it becomes useful. Looking at the bogland outside Millhaven, walking it over 3 days before she signed anything, she'd understood it was that day. The first summer was the hardest thing she had ever done. She and Calvin repaired the shack, 3 weeks of work that left them both exhausted, but at the end of it there was a roof that didn't leak and walls that were solid. Inez came out on weekends and helped where she could, which was more than it sounds, because Inez was the kind of person who figured out what needed doing without being asked and simply did it. Rowena had studied cranberry cultivation from 2 books she'd ordered by mail and one she'd borrowed from a library 2 counties over and returned 3 months late. She'd written letters to 2 growers in Massachusetts asking specific questions about bed preparation, water management, and what could be adapted for the Midwest climate. One of them wrote back. The letter was 4 pages long, and she read it until the paper wore through at the folds. Cranberries needed specific conditions: acidic, sandy soil layered over peat with reliable water access. The eastern section of her land had all of it. What it didn't have was the beds, the carefully shaped, leveled growing areas that allowed for controlled flooding and draining. She and Calvin dug the first bed by hand over the course of 6 weeks. They worked from first light until they couldn't see anymore. Calvin's hands blistered and healed and blistered again. Rowena's back hurt every morning for a month. They found a rhythm eventually, the kind that develops between people doing hard physical work together, where words become unnecessary, and the work itself becomes a kind of conversation. The bed was 40 feet wide and 200 feet long, and it took everything they had. When it was done, Rowena stood at one end of it in the late afternoon light and thought about her grandfather. She planted the first cuttings in August. Millhaven watched with the patient skepticism of a town that had seen people try things before. At the hardware store, Orville Tench said to anyone who asked that he gave her until the first hard frost. Claudette Mercer at the boarding house told her niece, who told someone else, that the bogland widow was one bad season from being back in the city somewhere, which was clearly where she belonged. A group of men at the barber shop on a Saturday morning discussed the drainage problem at length, and agreed among themselves that even if the woman managed to grow something out there, she'd never get it to market in the wet months because the road turned to soup. None of them said it to her face, which Rowena considered a mixed courtesy. She found out through Inez, who found out because people talked freely in front of school teachers, the way they talked in front of children. As though not being the subject of the conversation made you invisible. "Does it bother you?" Inez asked one evening. They were sitting on the repaired porch of the shack, which Rowena had started thinking of, cautiously, as the house. "Some," Rowena said. "What part?" Rowena thought about it. The part where they've already decided. She was quiet for a moment. A frog called from somewhere near the eastern channel. Another answered. "My grandfather used to say that the people who tell you something can't be done are usually describing their own limitations," she said, "not the actual limits of the thing." Inez looked at her. "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," Rowena said. The first winter was cold and long, but not catastrophic. The cuttings had rooted before the freeze, which was what she needed. Calvin spent the winter building a proper water control structure at the inlet of the eastern channel, a simple sluice gate that would allow her to flood the beds deliberately when she needed to. He'd never built anything like it before. Neither had she. They worked from a diagram she'd drawn based on the Massachusetts grower's letter, argued about the measurements 3 times, and got it right on the second attempt after getting it wrong on the first. In March, Rowena walked the beds and found the vines had survived. She stood there for a long time. The second summer was better than the first, though not in any way that Millhaven could see yet. The vines spread. The beds looked like nothing to an untrained eye, just low green growth over wet ground. Not impressive, not dramatic. When she told Orville Tench at the hardware store that the crop was coming along, he nodded in a way that meant he'd believe it when he saw it. She bought more wire and hardware cloth. She fixed the road from the main track to the house. A project she and Calvin did themselves over 2 weeks, laying gravel in the worst sections. It wasn't the nicest road in Harlan County, but it no longer turned to soup in the wet months, and it no longer made her worry about losing a wheel. In September, she saw the first berries. They were small. First-year cranberries always are, and there weren't enough of them to amount to anything commercially. But they were there, dark red against the green vines, and Rowena picked a handful and stood in the middle of the bed, holding them, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't sure what to call it. Not happiness exactly, more like confirmation. Like the land had looked at her plans and said, yes, and then the drought came. It came the following year, and it came hard. The spring of 1887 was the driest in memory across that part of the Midwest. By June, the creek that ran through the north end of Millhaven was down to a trickle. By July, it was nearly gone. The town had 2 wells, the one near the center square that everyone used, and an older one on the church property that had been dug in the previous decade. Both of them started going shallow in midsummer. The farms around Millhaven began to suffer visibly. Corn wilted in fields that had been planted with confidence in April. Kitchen gardens that usually fed families through the winter dried up before August. Livestock needed water that wasn't there, and the farmers were making hard choices, reducing herds, hauling water from sources increasingly far away, watching the sky every morning for clouds that didn't come. Rowena's land was different. The peat under her beds held moisture like a reservoir. The eastern channel, fed by a spring that the previous owners had never bothered to locate. She'd found it herself in her first month, following the slightly greener grass to its source, kept flowing even as everything else dried up. Not abundantly, but steadily. Enough. She had water when the town did not. She understood this as both an opportunity and a responsibility, which was something her grandfather had also told her, once, in a different context, and which she had filed away alongside everything else he'd ever said. The first person who came to her was a farmer named George Aldworth, whose place bordered the northern edge of her land. He was in his mid-50s, a deliberate man who chose his words the way some people chose their tools, with care and no extra. He came on a Tuesday morning in late July and stood at her gate and took his hat off when she came out. "Mrs. Stahl," he said, "I've heard you've still got water on your property." "I do," Rowena said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I've got 40 head of cattle and 2 horses, and I've been hauling water from Deaver Creek, which is barely running. I'd like to ask." He stopped, started again. "I'm not a man who finds this kind of asking easy. You want to water your animals at the channel," Rowena said, "if you'd allow it." She thought for a moment, not about whether, but about how. "I'll allow it for the cattle," she said. I need you to stay out of the south section nearest the beds, and I'll ask you to maintain the gate after each use." George Aldworth put his hat back on. "That's more than fair," he said. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing right now," Rowena said. "We can talk about the harvest in October." He looked at her with something she hadn't seen from Millhaven before. Not sympathy, not skepticism, but plain respect, the kind that one practical person shows another when they recognize a competence they didn't expect. "All right," he said. "Thank you." After George Aldworth came others. Not all of them came humbly. One farmer, a man named Preston Cork, who'd been among the more vocal at the barber shop about her road and her chances, came with a kind of aggressive entitlement that barely contained itself as a request. He stood in her yard and talked about what the community had always done for each other, and how it was a bad time for anyone to be thinking about themselves, and how he hoped she understood the situation. Rowena listened to him finish. "I do understand the situation," she said. "I've been managing it for 3 years now, mostly alone." Preston Cork's jaw moved. "You're welcome to bring your animals to the North Channel," she said. "Same conditions as everyone else. Stay out of the south section, maintain the gate. That's all I'm asking." He came. They all came eventually. She didn't keep score. That wasn't what it was about, and she knew it, and she thought her grandfather would have understood why. What she was doing wasn't revenge. Revenge required a kind of ongoing attention to injury that she didn't have energy for. What she was doing was just being the person who had water, and making a choice about what to do with it. It seemed to her the only choice worth making. By August, there was a path worn from the main road to her gate that hadn't been there in the spring. People came and went throughout the day. Calvin managed the gate rotation with the methodical seriousness he brought to most things now. He'd grown up a great deal in 2 years, and she noticed it, even if she didn't say so directly. Inez came out most evenings and stayed for supper and helped with whatever needed doing. She'd started teaching the children of some of the farmers, when their own school had closed early due to the heat and the general strain on the community, holding lessons in the shade behind the house, 3 days a week. Rowena watched it happening, the small town that had come to her gate, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter than that, like a long question that had finally been answered. One afternoon, Claudette Mercer came. She stood at the gate for a moment before Rowena saw her, and Rowena watched from across the yard. Claudette in her good dress, out of place on the farm path, looking at the house and the beds and the gate, with an expression that was working through several things at once. When she saw Rowena, she straightened up. "I came to ask about water for my kitchen garden," she said. "What's left of it? You can use the rain barrel by the north fence," Rowena said. "It's fed from the channel overflow. Help yourself." Claudette opened her mouth, closed it. Then she said, "I said some things last year. About you." "I know," Rowena said. It's all right," Rowena said, and she meant it, which seemed to surprise Claudette more than anything else. "Just maintain the barrel. Don't let it sit stagnant." Claudette Mercer nodded once, quickly, and went to get her water. The rains came back in September. They came slowly at first, a day here, a day there, and then a steady week of proper rain that brought the creek back and filled the wells and turned the county green again. People stood outside in it. Children ran in it. Farmers who hadn't smiled in months stood in their fields with their faces up. The drought had lasted less than 4 months. It had felt like longer. What Millhaven came out of it with was a different relationship to the bogland at the south end of town, and to the woman who lived there. Some people said things directly. George Aldworth came one October morning with a smoked ham and set it on her porch and said simply, "From my family to yours," and left before she could respond. Several of the women who'd been bringing children for Inez's lessons helped repair a section of fence that had washed out in the September rains. Orville Tench, at the hardware store, started keeping her account with a discount applied, without ever announcing that he'd done so or explaining why. Others didn't say anything at all. Some people are built that way, the acknowledgement lives in them, but it doesn't travel easily to the mouth. She understood. She was a little bit that way herself. The harvest that fall was her first real one. The cranberry beds, now in their 3rd year, produced more than she'd managed to project. She and Calvin flooded the beds in late September, the moment she'd been planning for since she'd walked this land the first time. The water rose over the vines, and the berries, loosened from their stems by the flood, floated to the surface in a wash of red so bright and strange that Calvin stood at the edge of the bed for a long time without saying anything. "It looks like," he started. "I know," Rowena said. They raked the berries to the edge with long-handled tools she'd had the mill fabricate to her specifications. They loaded them into crates and drove them to the rail depot in 3 trips over 2 days. The buyer from the grocery cooperative in the city had been skeptical when she'd written to him in June. He'd said there wasn't a cranberry operation in this part of the state, which she'd taken as information rather than discouragement, but he'd agreed to look at a sample. He bought everything she had. The letter with the payment arrived on a Thursday in November. Rowena sat at the kitchen table with it for a while. Then she called Calvin in from the yard and read him the number. He sat down in the chair across from her and was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said finally. "I believe you now." She laughed. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. It surprised her. Calvin smiled, which was something he did rarely and meant entirely. The following spring, 2 farmers from the south end of the county came to see her. They'd heard about the cranberry harvest. They wanted to know if their land, bottom land they'd written off years ago, might be suitable. She walked their property with them on a cold March morning. She looked at the soil. She looked at the water table indicators, the particular plants, the ground color, the way the frost had come and gone. She told them what she thought, honestly, including where it wouldn't work. One of them had potential. She told him so. She told him what it would take. He asked her if she'd help. "I'll help you plan it," she said. "The work is yours." He said that was fair. She drove home that afternoon on the road she'd graded herself 3 years ago, past the gate Calvin had built, past the beds that were still dormant under the late winter water, back to the house that had been a shack with a collapsed roof when she'd first seen it. The land was not beautiful in March. It was bare and wet and still, the way Midwestern land is in early spring, waiting. But she had stopped needing it to be beautiful to understand what it was. She'd learned that from her grandfather, too. Value and beauty are different things, and confusing them is how good land ends up in the wrong hands, or in no hands at all. She unhitched the horses and fed them and went inside to start supper. Outside, the eastern channel ran quiet and steady, the way it always did. The way it had been running, she now understood, long before she arrived, and would go on running long after, as long as someone was paying attention. That was what her grandfather had given her, in the end. Not the knowledge of cranberries, not the understanding of peat and water tables and acid soil, though all of that mattered. What he'd given her was the habit of paying attention to what was already there, to what the land was already doing, before anyone arrived with plans and ambitions and expectations of what it ought to be. She'd brought that habit to the bogland outside Millhaven. She'd brought it to the Drought. She'd brought it to every person who came to her gate that long summer, hat in hand. It was the most useful thing she owned. It had cost her nothing, and her grandfather, everything he'd learned in a lifetime. She thought about him most evenings, the way you think about people who are gone, but not absent, present in the things they made you notice, the questions they taught you to ask. The supper fire caught on the first try. She set the pot on and listened to the channel run, and outside the window the sky went from gray to a deep, clear dark, and the first stars came out over the bogland that had cost her $38 and given her in return everything she had.